They say it was never meant to open. A gate carved deep beneath the mountains, guarded by a man who vowed never to leave. Some called him a saint, others a prisoner. The monks who recorded his story vanished. The cave was sealed with iron and silence. Yet on winter nights, the stones hum softly, like breath beneath the earth. No one remembers his name, only his title, the Eternal Gatekeeper. And somewhere in northern Italy, that gate still waits. Now let the noise of the world fade. Imagine the chill of stone, the slow echo of water dripping in darkness. The story you're about to hear isn't a myth. It's a wound history tried to heal by forgetting. Centuries ago, a monk at St. Veneris Abbey wrote of a man sworn to guard the door between worlds. The chronicle was dismissed as superstition, yet fragments of it survive, ink-scorched margins burned. Locals in Valdorna still speak of a cave sealed by hands that feared what lay beyond. The church ignored it. Scholars laughed. But then came the map, old parchment showing a buried archway beneath the same valley. Some say the mountain hums each winter solstice as if something beneath still stirs. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history tried to erase. You begin as all stories of forbidden history do in silence. The St. Veneris Abbey no longer exists, at least not as it once did. Its bones rest in the hills of Emilia-Romagna, cloaked in ivy and the hum of bees. The church tower leans, the bells long melted down for war. Yet beneath those ruins lies what survived the fire of 1794, a single water-stained parchment written in cramped Gothic Latin. At first glance it reads like a prayer, but under candlelight the words shift. It is not a prayer at all, it is a record. The Chronicle of St. Veneris dates to 1264, attributed to a monk known only as Brother Corradinus. His handwriting is precise, almost mechanical, the kind that comes from fear of mistakes. He writes of a custodem aeternum, the eternal keeper, who was chosen to watch over Porta Eternitas, the eternal gate. The text claims that the gate was sealed by hands, anointed not in oil but in blood, and that its guardian was neither alive nor dead, but bound by vow. Scholars once labeled it allegory, a reflection on spiritual discipline. Yet the chronicler's tone betrays no metaphor. He describes physical details: the chill beneath the abbey floor, the metallic taste of the air near the sealed door, the echo that answers every whispered prayer. It would be easy to dismiss, if not for one anomaly. Corradinus writes of an eclipse that occurred during the sealing ceremony. Astronomers confirm that a total solar eclipse crossed northern Italy on August 11, 1264. The alignment is precise, accurate to the day. That historical fact anchors the chronicle in time, suggesting the event it describes may have been witnessed, not imagined. Then comes the curious detail, the kind that invites more questions than answers. A second hand appears in the manuscript, darker ink, hurried script. It interrupts the final paragraph with 3 Latin words, non aperiatur umquam. Let it never be opened. There is no signature, no explanation, only that stark warning, written as if in panic. Radiocarbon testing later proved the ink came from a different decade, perhaps 50 years later. Someone returned to this manuscript long after its creation, compelled to add a desperate plea. You picture the scene: a flickering candle, the scrape of quill on parchment, the heavy breath of someone who has seen too much. Maybe that person heard the hum the locals still speak of. Maybe they stood too close to the stones and felt the tremor beneath. Historians debate whether the chronicle was ever part of the abbey's official record. Some claim it was hidden, intentionally sealed within a hollow wall, discovered only in 1892. The text had been folded 13 times, an odd number in monastic tradition. 13 folds meant to conceal under divine burden. A phrase meaning what is hidden must stay hidden, for its revelation would harm the soul. The controversy deepens when you examine the seal affixed to the parchment. It bears not the abbey's emblem, but a symbol resembling an inverted sun, a circle with 12 rays pointing inward. Later, the same symbol will appear carved into stone near Valdorna, linking the chronicle to the gate's supposed location. For now, though, it remains an anomaly, a motif that should not exist in Christian manuscripts of that era. Some scholars insist the chronicle was a forgery produced during the Renaissance when mysticism was fashionable. Yet the parchments dating the ink composition and linguistic patterns all belong firmly to the 13th century. Others argue that it was real, but misinterpreted the gate serving as metaphor for divine truth rather than a literal structure. But here lies the debate's heart. If it were allegory, why would a monk risk excommunication by recording it in secret without his abbot's approval? You recall the faint hum described in the opening story, the mountain's pulse beneath Valdorna. The chronicle's final line might hold the key, and the stone sang when sealed. The phrase has puzzled translators for centuries. Some say it refers to the resonance of a massive iron gate. Others claim it hints at something alive beneath the stone. Either way, the image lingers, a door that sings when closed, a gate that must never be opened again. In the late 19th century, before the abbey's last collapse, a Jesuit historian named Father Angelo Ratti studied the chronicle in person. He described the parchment as a living wound on the page. His notes, preserved in the Vatican archives, reveal that the ink under ultraviolet light showed faint script beneath the visible text, an earlier layer of writing scraped away. The hidden line, translated loosely, read, "He was not the first." That single sentence changed everything. If there was one eternal gatekeeper, there might have been others. The idea terrified the Church, for it implied a lineage of guardians preceding Christianity itself. The Vatican ordered Ratti's findings sealed. 2 years later, he disappeared while traveling through Lombardy. His final letter, dated June 7, 1897, ends abruptly, "I have seen the stone." That same letter would later resurface in private hands, sold at auction in 1983. The buyer's name remains undisclosed. The envelope bore no wax seal, only the faint impression of an inverted sun. And so, from one charred piece of parchment, the investigation begins. The Chronicle of St. Veneris was not simply a text. It was an opening, a whisper through time, reminding you that history sometimes hides its truths, not because they are false, but because they are unbearable. When you close your eyes, you can almost hear Brother Corradinus, still writing in the dark, scratching his warning into the silence, "Let it never be opened." You can't help but wonder about the man behind the title. Custos Aeternus, the eternal keeper. Brother Corradinus described him as both chosen and cursed, but nowhere in the surviving manuscripts does his name appear. Not once. Not even an initial. It is as though the gatekeeper was never meant to be remembered as a man, only as an office, a duty. And yet history has a way of leaving fingerprints even on erased faces. In the early 1300s, 50 years after the Chronicle was written, another record surfaces in the papal archives, a list of excommunicated monks from the northern provinces. One entry, half faded, mentions a custodian of the door accused of idolatrous worship of the threshold. The ink has been deliberately smudged, the name scraped away with a blade. But beneath the damage, under raking light, a few letters remain visible. Arius. A fragment of an identity, a ghost of a name. The historical fact is clear enough. In 1315, a heresy tribunal was convened in Parma to investigate a sect known as the Fratres Obscuri Portae, the Brothers of the Dark Gate. They were charged with maintaining an unauthorized shrine, performing night vigils before a sealed cave, and refusing to abandon what they called the Oath of Continuance. Most were executed or fled into the Apennines. The cave they guarded was collapsed by order of the Inquisition. The documents note it as a containment, not a destruction. Even the Church's language betrays a strange caution. It is within those tribunal minutes that the phrase custos aeternus reappears. The chief inquisitor, Bernardus de Vico, described the accused as a man who bears the name of no man, the servant of silence. The record ends abruptly there with a wide inkblot, as if someone had spilled their own nervousness onto the page. That simple error feels human. You can almost imagine the scribe's trembling hand. The controversy around these records is still alive among historians. Some interpret them as part of the broader persecution of millenarian sects, those who believed the end of the world was imminent. Others insist the Brothers of the Dark Gate were never heretics at all, but a remnant of an older monastic order, tasked with guarding something the Church could not comprehend. The debate hinges on that missing name. Without it, no lineage can be traced, no ancestry confirmed. Yet the absence itself feels purposeful, almost curated, as though history conspired to bleach him from memory. A curious artifact complicates things further. In 1934, an Italian archaeologist named Paolo Cerenzi unearthed a marble relief near the foundations of the former abbey. The relief depicts a robed figure standing before an arched doorway, one hand raised in benediction, the other gripping a key. The inscription beneath barely legible reads, Custos Aet, before breaking off where the stone has been cleanly chiseled away. Someone at some point removed the rest. Cerenzi's notes mention the tool marks were recent, less than a century old at the time of discovery, which means the erasure happened after the abbey fell into ruin, long after the gatekeeper's story should have faded into obscurity. You might ask who in the 19th century still feared a name from the 13th. Perhaps those who still guarded the place. There's another detail that rarely appears in public discussions, buried in a Vatican inventory catalog. It lists confiscated objects from suppressed monasteries, relics, manuscripts, icons. One entry is especially strange, a key of iron mixed with unknown alloy origin, unverified. The catalog number corresponds to a shipment from St. Veneris in 1792, 2 years before the fire that erased its archives. The key was never recovered, but the description matches the relief in Cerenzi's excavation, the same gesture, the same material. A connection, fragile but undeniable, begins to form. A monk without a name. A key that reappears across centuries. A vow that outlived its own language. The open question, one that splits modern scholars, is whether the erasure of the gatekeeper's name was punishment or protection. Some propose he was condemned, his name struck out as an act of damnation. Others believe the opposite, that anonymity was sanctified, intended to seal his memory, so that what he guarded could not find him again. In medieval theology, to name something was to give it power. To remove a name was to unmake its hold on the world. There's a faint callback here to the Chronicle's hidden line, he was not the first. If others came before him, perhaps their names too were erased. Each gatekeeper unmade in turn, until only the title remained, an unbroken chain of silence spanning centuries. Somewhere between superstition and bureaucracy, a man's identity dissolved. But traces still whisper through time. In a private letter dated 1712, an abbot from a nearby monastery mentions the nameless brother who still keeps watch, though his bones are dust. The phrasing suggests continuity, as if the gatekeeper's duty persisted beyond death. Was it metaphor Or was there truly a succession, each keeper replacing the last name erased anew, standing in the ruins today? You can feel that void. The stone seems to repel identity, its inscriptions melted into anonymity. Even tourists report their voice echoing strangely, as though the air refuses to remember sound. Maybe it's geology. Maybe it's something else. Every era leaves behind its absences, but this one feels deliberate, sculpted. The gatekeeper's missing name is more than a historical inconvenience, it's a mechanism. A lock made of forgetting, and like any lock, it implies something waiting to be kept shut. The cave collapse, ordered by the Inquisition in 1315, was supposed to have sealed the site forever. Yet records from 1769, almost 5 centuries later, tell a different story. In the travel diary of a French Jesuit named Father Lucien Duret, a passage describes a hollow in the earth beneath the bones of St. Veneris Abbey, where the air itself moves as though in respiration. He never names the place directly, but his description matches the topography of the ruins perfectly. Father Duret's entry is unsettlingly precise. He writes of a fissure at the lowest point of the old crypt, narrow enough to crawl through where a steady pulse of air ebbs and flows. Exhalatio sine vento, a breath without wind. He notes that the phenomenon stops abruptly when the name of God is spoken aloud, only to resume moments later stronger, like something listening. His companions reportedly refused to go near the fissure after hearing a faint mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate inside their skulls. Duret attributed it to acoustic resonance, though his handwriting wavers noticeably in those paragraphs, as if even he didn't believe himself. The final page of that entry ends mid-sentence, and at the third exhalation, I saw with clear eyes the impression of a hand against the stone pressing outward. That diary, preserved in a private Jesuit archive, would remain unknown until it surfaced at an estate auction in Lyon in 1998. The page describing the handprint was found scorched around the edges, as though someone had tried to burn just that portion. The ink, however, survived. Later geological studies of the St. Veneris site found no evidence of volcanic vents or airflow systems that could explain a breathing cave. The air, they said, was completely still, but one peculiar reading stood out: faint electromagnetic pulses, rhythmic, emanating from deep beneath the bedrock. Every pulse exactly 11 minutes apart. Coincidence, perhaps. Yet the Chronicle's numerology, if you recall, the earlier cipher places special emphasis on the number 11. 11 lines between invocations, 11 candles on the altar, 11 syllables in the closing benediction. To medieval mystics, 11 symbolized the broken completion, a step beyond perfection into the forbidden. Even skeptics find that alignment difficult to ignore. A more recent discovery, published quietly in a 2013 Italian academic journal, reports that the soil within the crypt's lowest chamber contains unusually high concentrations of magnetite, an iron oxide often associated with lodestones, capable of disrupting compasses and electronic instruments. Researchers attempting to map the space reported repeated data corruption and a curious auditory phenomenon. All their recordings contained a low background tone, like a human breath captured between words. When played backward, that breath forms a pattern matching the same 11-minute rhythm. It's tempting, of course, to dismiss all this as folklore repackaged for the modern age. Yet every investigation, however empirical, seems to brush against something that resists full definition. Each attempt to measure or map the gate leads instead to distortion of data, of sound, of memory itself. Father Duret may have exaggerated, but his closing note, one written days later in steadier ink, lingers in the margins. To name it is to open it. If that's true, then perhaps the monks' silence, their erasure of the gatekeeper's name, was not superstition, but engineering an act of spiritual containment. The name was the key, and forgetting was the lock. Yet something still breathes below. For centuries, the gatekeeper was remembered only by his title. The monks who chronicled his existence called him Custos Aeternus, the Eternal Warden. His real name was deliberately erased from every surviving manuscript. But history, as it often does, left a few cracks. In 1892, an antiquarian named Giacomo Ferrata purchased a collection of damaged ecclesiastical scrolls from an abandoned chapel near Genoa. Among them was a parchment fragment bearing a partial inscription, servant of the seal called by the name A. The rest was torn away. Ferrata filed it under irrelevant scraps and forgot about it. But in 1934, a German philologist named Otto Kessler revisited the piece and noticed faint impressions left in the parchment fiber's indentations from missing letters that once followed the A. Using oblique lighting and chemical analysis, Kessler reconstructed the next few characters. The fragment, he concluded, once read, Elricus. That single name triggered a storm among historians of early Christian mysticism. Elricus appeared nowhere in official church records, but showed up repeatedly in apocryphal texts tied to the 13th century, always near stories of forbidden rites and watchers at the threshold. One obscure codex, the Testament of the Silent Path, describes Elric the Guardian, who stood where light ends and form dissolves. Was this poetic metaphor, or a veiled reference to the same gatekeeper? Cross-referencing these scattered sources reveals something remarkable. Elricus is consistently associated with architectural seals, arches, thresholds, and sigils designed to contain divine remainder. In one version of the tale, he was said to have volunteered to stay behind when a failed ritual threatened to release something unbound. His vow, I will hold it until memory forgets my name. When monks later erased that name from every record, they may have been honoring his request. Oblivion as protection. But here's where the trail turns stranger. In 2007, a researcher named Emilia Croft used multispectral imaging to scan the original Saint Veneris Chronicle. Beneath layers of palimpsest text ink overwritten across centuries, she discovered a hidden line visible only under ultraviolet light. It read, Elricus custodum portae aeternum. Elric, the eternal keeper of the gate. The text had been deliberately scraped away and rewritten with harmless liturgical passages. Yet the outline of the letters remained like a ghost beneath the surface. Croft's discovery reignited interest in the mystery and prompted a linguistic analysis of Aelricus's name. Derived from Old Germanic roots, Adel noble and Ric ruler, it carries the meaning noble protector or guardian of power. The name itself embodies his function. Coincidence or intention? Adding to the intrigue, a later document from 1721, an anonymous monastic letter archived in Venice, mentions a statue in the likeness of Elricus, whose eyes are sealed with iron. That statue has never been found, but an 18th century inventory list from the same abbey references one effigy of the keeper stored in the lower sacristy. If that effigy exists, it may still rest beneath the collapsed ruins of St. Veneris. Archaeologists have never excavated that section, citing structural instability. But ground-penetrating radar images show an object roughly man-sized buried under 2 meters of debris. For now, Elricus remains a name whispered across broken pages, a man half erased by his own vow. Yet his shadow stretches across every surviving clue, from the pulsing cave beneath the abbey to the rhythmic hum that science still cannot explain. To the monks, he was the one who stood watch at the boundary of existence. To us, he is the first real sign that the eternal gatekeeper was not merely legend, but a man whose silence still guards something unspeakable. You don't hear their name spoken aloud in any church, nor written openly in any record. The Ordo Solis Nigri, The Order of the Black Sun appears only in marginalia scratched in the borders of monastic codices, or murmured through confessions that were never meant to survive. It is said they were born from the same monastery that preserved the legend of Elricus, sworn not to worship the gate, but to guard it. Their story begins around the late 1200s, when the Benedictine reforms swept across Italy, forcing smaller Hermitic sects to submit to papal oversight. One group refused. Their abbot, a man identified only as Prior Thalen, wrote to the Holy See declaring that his order would answer only to the keeper who stands between worlds. The Vatican condemned the letter as heretical, but before inquisitors arrived, the abbey had already vanished, its halls abandoned, its altars stripped bare. All that remained were symbols burned into the stone, interlocking circles radiating from a central void. Later scholars would call it the Black Sun Sigil. The order re-emerged centuries later, mentioned fleetingly in a 1623 Jesuit report, describing men who wear the tonsure, but speak no vows, who guard the old seals beneath Valdorna. The author, Father Lorenzo Bellini, dismissed them as relics of medieval superstition. Yet his own diary, recovered after his death, records a chilling encounter. He wrote that while investigating strange chants echoing through the Valdorna Valley at dusk, he was met by a procession of hooded monks bearing torches, moving without sound, as if their feet did not touch the earth. When he called out to them, they stopped, but none turned their faces toward him. Then, in perfect unison, they extinguished their lights, and the valley fell silent. Bellini fled that night, never to return. Modern historians have argued whether the order truly existed or was merely an invention of fearful clergy. But in 1956, during restoration work at the ruined Abbey of St. Veneris, workers discovered a hidden chamber behind the apse. On its soot-darkened walls were painted concentric suns, the innermost ring inked so densely it absorbed every trace of light. In the center, the Latin phrase lux cadit custos manet, light falls, the keeper remains. That phrase had appeared once before in the Testament fragment attributed to Elricus. The connection cannot be coincidence. The chamber also contained a small reliquary box filled with blackened wax seals, each stamped with the same sigil. When melted and analyzed, the wax was found to contain traces of mercury and human blood. Not exactly the ingredients of ordinary monastic paraphernalia. According to Amelia Croft, the same researcher who rediscovered Elricus's name, the order may have formed as a clandestine continuation of his vow. When the Church absorbed or suppressed divergent monastic groups, some brethren might have chosen to preserve the gate's secret outside ecclesiastical control. They became custodians of silence, believing that to speak of the gate was to weaken the seal. One 14th-century letter recovered from the Vatican's Archivum Secretum, now simply called the Apostolic Archive, mentions an excommunication issued against those who worship darkness in the guise of guardianship. Yet even there the language is careful, almost uncertain. The author confesses that the accused seek not the devil but his prison. That single line fascinates theologians to this day. What kind of faith prays for a prison never to open skeptics? Point out that the term Black Sun has appeared throughout European esotericism, often symbolizing hidden wisdom or divine inversion. But the Valdorna variant predates those traditions. Its depiction, a dark core surrounded by fading light, echoes the gate's own structure, as described in the Chronicle of St. Veneris, a circular portal framed by alternating bands of obsidian and limestone designed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. Some claim the Order of the Black Sun was wiped out during the Napoleonic campaigns, when French troops razed numerous monasteries suspected of sheltering counter-revolutionaries. Yet local folklore in Lombardy tells another story. that descendants of the order survived, blending into rural parishes and continuing their vigil in secret. Farmers speak of solitary priests who never celebrate Mass, who walk the fields at night murmuring to the earth. You recall how in the previous section, the hidden inscription beneath St. Veneris' parchment preserved Aelricus's name through centuries of erasure. The same method text, concealed beneath text, appears in later documents attributed to the order. It seems the keepers learned their craft from the first keeper himself. Silence encoded beneath devotion. An ongoing scholarly debate now divides those who study the phenomenon. One camp insists the order was a fabrication, an allegory invented by frightened monks to rationalize the unknown. The other argues the evidence points to an unbroken lineage of guardians whose ritual persistence kept something sealed below Valdorna. Neither side has managed to explain the chamber's inscriptions or the faint hum recorded there by sound engineers, a low pulse repeating every 88 seconds, like a hidden heartbeat beneath stone, a final curiosity. When restoration workers first entered that chamber in 1956, they reported a peculiar sensation as though their own breathing slowed to match the rhythmic vibration. One man joked it felt like the walls were breathing with us. They laughed then. None of them slept well for weeks afterward. When you walk through the remnants of St. Veneris Abbey today, you can still smell the fire. Not the sharp sting of fresh ash, but the ghost of it, a dry metallic scent, clinging to the walls as if the stones themselves remember being burned. In 1794, the Abbey's vast archive, 6 centuries of manuscripts, codices, and ledgers, was reduced to embers. The official record blames a lightning strike during a summer storm. But the Abbey stands at the base of a mountain, not its peak, and no other building in the valley was touched by flame. The monks wrote nothing afterward. The silence that followed was total, almost reverent, as though the fire had consumed not only the pages, but their will to speak. What exactly was lost? According to restoration inventories from the following century, the Abbey's collection once contained records of custodian oaths, maps of subterrane chapels, and a chronicle of the unnamed keeper. The phrasing matches fragments from the Chronicle of St. Veneris, the same document that first mentioned the gatekeeper. If those records still existed, we might have possessed an unbroken chain of evidence from the 13th century to the dawn of modernity. But the fire erased everything, or almost everything. One ledger slightly singed around the edges was discovered years later in a private archive in Florence. It was catalogued under an unrelated title, Annus Obscurus, 1794. Inside were 15 pages of inventory, written hastily, as though the scribe knew time was running short. Each entry lists an item marked for removal before the fire reliquaries scrolls iron keys, even an entire altar stone. The final entry is crossed out, but the words remain legible: Custodia Veneris, Manus Testamenta. The keeper's testament. Whoever wrote that ledger wanted it hidden. A seal from the Order of the Black Sun appears faintly impressed into the final page, almost erased, but still discernible under angled light. A perfect circle surrounded by fading rays. You've seen it before in the hidden chamber, unearthed 2 centuries later. The same phrase accompanies it, lux cadet custos manet. Light falls, the keeper remains. If we trust the handwriting comparison, and the experts at the Museo di Torino confirm the match, then the monk who compiled this last ledger also served as the Abbey's archivist. His name was Brother Anselmo. Curiously, Anselmo disappears from parish records after 1794. No burial certificate, no transfer order, no sign he left Italy. It's as if he burned with the rest. But in the margin of another unrelated document, a correspondence between the Abbey and a Venetian bookseller, someone has scribbled a short note, Anselmo porta la chiave. Anselmo carries the key. The implication is tantalizing. Could a single monk have salvaged the gatekeeper's testament before the fire? Or did he light the flames himself to erase the secret forever? The debate divides historians. The conventional theory holds that lightning indeed struck the abbey's bell tower, igniting the dry timbers that spanned its roof. Yet contemporary witnesses record no storm that night. One merchant's journal from the nearby town of Malvaro describes a red glow upon the northern sky, and the bells of St. Veneris tolling, though no hands pulled the rope. By morning, only charred stone remained. Theories multiply like roots beneath the soil. Some claim Napoleonic agents set the fire, seizing relics thought to hold esoteric power. Others whisper that the church itself ordered the destruction after a forbidden ritual had been attempted, an echo of the same silence that followed the order's disappearance. What makes this fire particularly suspicious is what happened after. Within months, an official edict dissolved the abbey entirely. Its surviving monks were reassigned, its lands sold, its ruins left to decay. The Vatican's decree cited structural instability as the reason, though travelers who visited in the years following described the remaining walls as solid, though silent. What was truly unstable, it seems, was not the stone but the story it contained. Here, the historical record grows strange. In 1796, 2 years after the fire, a letter from a parish priest in Valdorna mentions a sealed reliquary found beneath the chapel foundation. The letter describes a box of blackened iron still warm to the touch, despite lying buried in cold earth. Inside were fragments of parchment fused together by heat. A chemist who later examined the scraps claimed to detect traces of mercury, the same element used in the alloy of the gate itself. Coincidence, perhaps, or continuity. And there's another connection. One surviving scrap bore a single Latin phrase, vigilate donec rideat, keep watch until he returns. The handwriting matches that of the earlier custodian's testament. Whatever burned in 1794, it wasn't an accident of weather. It was an attempt to erase a vow that had survived too long. When I tell people this story, they usually ask the same question: why not rebuild the archives? Why not recover what was lost? But rebuilding a library is not like rebuilding a wall. You can replace the stone, but not the silence. And in Valdorna, silence is a kind of language. It hums through the remaining cloisters, lingers beneath the echo of each footstep. The monks, it seems, had learned something terrible, and then chose to burn their own history, rather than let it spread. Skeptics remind us that Europe's monastic fires were common in that era. Candlelight neglect and dry parchment made for combustible conditions. Still, one cannot ignore that the very collection destroyed was the only one known to reference the gate, the keeper, and the order that guarded them. If it were truly coincidence, it is a cruel one. You think back to the symbols uncovered in the hidden chamber, the ones painted in layers of soot and ash. Perhaps they were not decorations at all, but reminders that what is destroyed in flame is not always gone. Sometimes it hides like ink burned invisible by its own secrecy, waiting to be seen again. And sometimes fire is not destruction, but closure, the only way to keep a promise from being broken. It began, as so many medieval horrors did, with the smell. The chronicles describe a sweet, heavy stench drifting down from the Valdorna hills during the summer of 1348, the same year the Black Death tore through Europe. The villagers said the odor came from the caves beneath the abbey, from the stone gate that the monks called Porta Aeternum. Livestock sickened. Wells turned sour. And when the first bodies were found in the valley, their skin marked not with buboes, but faint gray streaks shaped almost like fingers pressed into the flesh. The rumor spread the gate had been disturbed. In a world where divine wrath explained everything, it didn't take long for blame to find a form. Local superstition claimed that every 7 generations, the gate demanded tribute not in gold or blood, but in silence. If the chants that sealed it were forgotten, the sickness would return. And yet buried in parish records from that same year is something stranger, a note from an abbey physician who swore the disease reached St. Veneris before the first travelers from the south arrived. No ships came, he wrote. No rats, no fleas. Only the earth itself groaned. That sentence appears in the same codex that later chronicled the gatekeeper's oath. It's one of the few direct overlaps between religious legend and medical observation, an uncomfortable bridge between faith and fact. Scholars often debate whether the gate and the plague ever truly intersected, or if frightened monks simply folded the great pandemic into their own mythology. But the timing refuses to let go. Each recorded disturbance around the Valdorna gate seems to echo moments of mass illness or panic, 1348, 1523, 1629 each, coinciding with smaller outbreaks of plague in northern Italy. None reached catastrophic proportions like the first, but all left behind the same whispers. Strange lights near the mountain hymns sung at night, and the tolling of bells no one admits to ringing. A century later, a papal envoy named Matteo Rinaldi visited Valdorna to investigate what he called persistence of heathen ritual. His surviving letters describe a monastery sealed by its own brethren, its monks refusing entry to outsiders. He wrote that they kept constant watch over a sealed door in the rock, chanting prayers that were neither Latin nor Greek. Rinaldi demanded to hear these words himself. He wrote that when he did, the ground trembled softly, as though echoing the sound back from below. When the envoy attempted to record the chant phonetically, his script breaks midway. The ink trails off the page, then resumes with only one sentence, non ad Deum cantant. They do not sing to God. The next day, Rinaldi left Valdorna and never returned. It's easy centuries later to dismiss such accounts as hysteria. The plague had unmoored the medieval mind. The Church itself wrestled to reconcile divine punishment with earthly contagion. Still, something about the gate's timing unsettles even rational historians. The plague waves that followed each disturbance in Valdorna always appeared first in isolated mountain villages before spreading outward, the inverse of typical epidemiological patterns which began in trade ports and descended inland. You might recall how the Order of the Black Sun vowed eternal silence, believing that speech itself weakened the seal. Imagine what it meant to live through a pandemic in that valley, surrounded by death and forbidden even to cry out. The silence may have been as deadly as the disease itself, and yet beneath the superstition lies a pattern. Modern climatologists studying the same region have noted geological activity, small tremors, pockets of methane release, and even thermal anomalies recorded roughly once every 200 years. Each corresponds eerily with the historical disturbances mentioned in abbey records. In other words, the gate's rumblings may have been entirely natural. But the monks, not understanding seismology, mistook the earth's breath for something far older, far hungrier. Still, there's a wrinkle. In 2007, a geological survey found an anomaly near the original St. Veneris site, a shaft extending deeper than expected, its inner walls coated with an unknown residue that interfered with carbon dating. Trace samples contained mercury again, that same element tied to the gate's metallic frame. This suggests some form of intentional sealing compound had been applied centuries before modern metallurgy could explain its properties. Coincidence, perhaps, but it ties back to the Testament fragment, that warned the gate does not guard what lies beyond it, guards what remains within. Historians remain divided. One camp argues the monks simply used the gate legend to maintain moral order during crisis, a convenient myth to keep villagers obedient and fearful. The other suspects the opposite, that the myth concealed a deeper truth, one too dangerous to record plainly. If the gate's disturbance coincided with the plague, perhaps the two were linked, not by cause but by consequence, that something sealed beneath Valdorna stirred only when the world above grew weak. You can almost picture it, the valley silent, except for coughing torches, flickering the few surviving monks, kneeling before the sealed stone, begging their absent god for mercy, while keeping their eyes fixed on the cracks. They must have believed that if the gate opened, the plague would be mercy by comparison. Centuries later, when restoration workers unearthed the abbey's foundations, they found several small recesses built into the wall, each containing a human skull wrapped in parchment. When translated, the script repeated a single prayer, "May silence bind what our faith cannot." There's something haunting about that phrase. It doesn't plead for salvation. It accepts defeat, as though the monks no longer prayed to win, only to delay the inevitable. So was the gate truly the source of their plague? Maybe not. But in every generation, something did escape fear, memory, myth. And those things spread faster than disease. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen was not a man easily frightened. The Holy Roman Emperor, known to his contemporaries as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, spoke 6 languages, kept a private zoo, and wrote treatises on falconry and philosophy in equal measure. He debated scholars, mocked superstition, and saw himself as the bridge between reason and divinity. Yet in the winter of 1239 he sent a sealed letter to the abbots of northern Italy, bearing a single command: find the eternal door. No historian can say exactly where he first heard of it. Some believe a Cistercian emissary brought him tales of a gate that hums beneath the earth. Others claim the legend reached him through his experiments with Arab alchemists, whose texts spoke of thresholds that divide matter from spirit. Whatever the source, something in the story seized him completely. Frederick's archives, what remain of them, reveal a slow descent into obsession. His early correspondence shows curiosity. If such a portal exists, he wrote to his court astrologer Michael Scott, it is the last remnant of divine architecture, proof that heaven and hell are but directions. But by 1243 his tone changes. He orders excavations, dispatches engineers, and sends letters to monasteries requesting maps of ancient ceilings. One such request reached St. Veneris Abbey, the same monastery that guarded the gate's legend. The abbot's reply, curiously polite, declined to assist, citing duties of silence and preservation. Frederick's response was anything but polite. A decree from the following year threatened confiscation of abbey lands for withholding relics of imperial interest. Within months, 2 of his envoys disappeared while traveling through Valdorna. Official reports blamed brigands, but the emperor's physician, writing privately, noted strange lights near the mountains and whispers that the monks had spoken a curse. You've probably noticed a pattern by now. Anyone who came too close to the gate's secret met either erasure or fire. Frederick's campaign was no exception. Yet what sets him apart is that he didn't fear the gate, he wanted it opened. One letter preserved in the Vatican's Regesta Imperiae captures his reasoning in chilling clarity: if God hides behind a wall, then let man break the stone. That line alone would have earned him eternal condemnation from the Church. But Frederick was already excommunicated twice, in fact. The Pope called him the Antichrist. Frederick called the Pope a merchant of souls. Between them stood the shadow of Valdorna, a mountain whose silence neither could command. Records indicate that around 1246, Frederick dispatched a team of alchemists led by Johannes de Erfurt, a scholar obsessed with transmutation and sacred geometry. Their task: locate the so-called eternal door and analyze its composition. In a letter addressed to his treasurer, Frederick ordered the provision of quicksilver iron filings and powdered coral materials, later found to match the alloy known as the seal of three metals. If the emperor truly possessed knowledge of that formula centuries before its rediscovery, it suggests he either had access to ancient sources or found something beneath the earth that taught him. Johannes de Erfurt's writings, rediscovered in fragments during the 19th century, describe a gate of neither stone nor metal, but both, and between them something that breathes. He claimed that the gate's surface pulsed faintly, as though moved by the heart of the mountain itself. His notes end abruptly mid-sentence. What became of him is unknown. But a ledger entry from Frederick's later years lists 10 men lost to the silence of Valdorna. The emperor's fascination seems to have ended then. Or perhaps not. In 1250, as Frederick lay dying in Apulia, he reportedly whispered a phrase that his chroniclers found baffling: "The keeper waits for no king." Some interpreted it as madness, others as prophecy. But in his personal seal, still preserved in the Palermo archives, there appears a faint engraving not found in earlier versions, a circular sun with a darkened core. The same symbol used by the Order of the Black Sun centuries later. Coincidence or legacy? The Church, for its part, moved swiftly to distance itself from the emperor's experiments. After his death, papal envoys confiscated his private libraries, burning or sealing anything related to alchemy. Yet one papal archivist, Brother Matteo Alighieri, copied a portion of a confiscated codex before it vanished. His transcription survives. The emperor believed the gate led not to the divine, but to the design, the machinery of creation itself. He sought the voice that moves the spheres. That single line has fueled endless speculation. Some scholars claim it refers to the medieval notion of musica universalis, the harmony of the cosmos. Others suspect something far stranger, that Frederick believed the gate concealed a literal mechanism, a structure through which divine energy could be studied, perhaps even controlled. And maybe that's what doomed him. Because if the gate was ever meant to be a prison, as later evidence will suggest, then Frederick, in his boundless curiosity, was the first to try to pick its lock. Centuries later, when miners uncovered the first traces of the gate's outer seal, they found something embedded in the rock, a copper medallion bearing the imperial eagle of Hohenstaufen, its wings folded inward, as though shielding itself. No record explains how it got there. Historians call it an anomaly. The locals call it a warning. It's a strange irony. The most powerful man in Christendom spent his life trying to open the door to eternity, and in the end, eternity opened first. If Emperor Frederick's obsession brought the legend of the Eternal Gate into the light, then the monks of St. Veneris Abbey spent centuries making sure it disappeared again. Perched high above the misted valleys of Valdorna, the abbey's walls were said to breathe with the mountain. To outsiders, it was simply a remote Benedictine outpost. To those who dared look closer, it was a fortress of secrets. St. Veneris was founded in 841 AD not for prayer, but for containment. The founding charter, preserved in the Vatican's restricted archives, describes its purpose with a single cryptic line: "Here shall be kept the breath that must not escape." At first glance, it sounds poetic, but the Abbey's later records turn that metaphor into something chillingly literal. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, strange shipments were documented arriving under papal seal iron locks, forged chains, barrels of quicklime. An inventory from 1179 lists 7 bells cast not to ring but to bind. No historian can say what that means. Yet when Frederick II's envoys arrived centuries later demanding access to the gate, these monks responded with the words that would echo across generations: "The keeper stirs." What did they mean by keeper? To understand that, we must examine the codex known as De Silentio Aeterno, of eternal silence. It's a manuscript unlike any other in monastic history. 97 pages of dense Latin script interlaced with ink drawings of geometric symbols, including the same tri-metal ring we've encountered before. The codex first appeared in the abbey's scriptorium around 1180, but it was never meant to be read widely. Only the abbot and 2 designated custodians were permitted access. Everyone else, even the monks who copied the text, worked from redacted fragments replacing forbidden passages with the phrase verbum clausum, the closed word. When fragments of De Silentio Aeterno resurfaced in the 19th century, scholars dismissed them as superstition. But more recent analysis, especially the 1983 work of historian Carlo Morsini, has changed that view. Morsini discovered that the codex's language occasionally shifts from Latin to Old Syriac, specifically in passages describing the threshold mechanism. One translated segment reads, "Beneath the gate lies the heart, and in the heart a song. When the song stops, the world begins again." It's an impossible statement, and yet it aligns eerily with later reports of tones heard beneath the mountain. Could the monks have known something that science has only recently begun to rediscover, that sound itself can alter physical structure? According to Morsini's analysis, the keeper described in the text was not a person, but a force, a presence tasked with ensuring the heart never ceases to hum. The monks believed their role was not to worship it, but to contain it. Their prayers, chants, and midnight vigils were not rituals of devotion, but of maintenance designed to sustain the equilibrium that held the gate sealed. And yet sometime around the mid-13th century, something changed. Records indicate that during Frederick II's final years, the abbey suffered a fire that destroyed half its cloisters. The surviving documents refer cryptically to the night the silence broke. Witness statements preserved by neighboring monasteries describe a deep sound rolling across the valley. Not thunder, not an earthquake, but a note that lingered without air. One monk reportedly went mad, claiming to hear footsteps in the light. After that event, the abbey sealed itself completely. No pilgrim or emissary was allowed entry. For nearly 300 years, its existence faded into obscurity, known only to a handful of clerical historians. When the Reformation swept through Europe, St. Veneris was already a ghost. It wasn't rediscovered until 1786, when a group of Savoyard explorers stumbled upon its ruins. Inside, they found manuscripts petrified into ash and a single room carved into the mountain wall, a narrow chamber lined with concentric circles of blackened stone. At its center was a hollow, roughly the size of a human body, surrounded by inscriptions too eroded to read. But one word remained clear: custos, Latin for keeper. The explorers left quickly. Their journals, later published by the Royal Geographical Society, note that the temperature within the chamber was unnaturally cold, though no source of wind could be found. They also mentioned hearing a low vibration, as if the rock itself murmured. The local villagers refused to approach the site afterward. They said the gate still breathed not constantly, but in rhythm with something unseen. When modern archaeologists revisited the ruins in 1991 using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered cavities extending beneath the abbey far deeper than the building's foundations. The data revealed what appeared to be a circular shaft, sealed with an alloy exhibiting magnetic properties inconsistent with any medieval metallurgy. Tests on residual fragments suggested the presence of iridium and mercury, both rare in nature, but highly conductive in specific combinations. Was this the gate the monks protected? Or merely another part of the elaborate myth that centuries of fear and faith had built? Here's what's most intriguing among the recovered artifacts was a small copper plaque inscribed in archaic Latin. The translation reads, "When the song ends, he will wake. Therefore we must never stop the hymn." It's a strange command, one that hints at perpetual vigilance. But perhaps it also explains why the monks of St. Veneris isolated themselves from the world. To them, silence was not peace. Silence was death. The gate, they believed, was a boundary that sang, and to let that song fade would mean unbinding the thing that waited behind it. In the next section, we'll examine the only surviving modern account from someone who claimed to hear that sound firsthand, a man whose recordings still defy classification. You don't expect the ground to sing. Rocks should be silent, eternal, the mute bones of the world. But in the valleys around Valdorna, locals tell a different story, that the earth hums low and steady like something dreaming far below. The first reports came not from mystics or priests, but from miners, hard men, pragmatic men. And when practical men start swearing they heard voices in stone, history tends to take notice. It began in 1853 when a mining consortium from Turin secured permission to dig into the limestone hills east of the ruined St. Veneris Abbey. The project promised quick profits, the region was rich in copper and quartz, and the Industrial Revolution was hungry for both. For several months, the work went smoothly. Then the tremors began. Small at first, barely noticeable, until one night the miners described a deep resonance that rolled through the tunnels and lingered like the aftermath of thunder. Giovanni Mazzoni, the foreman, kept a meticulous journal. His entries, preserved in the regional archives, are strange even by 19th century standards. On April 12th, he wrote, "The stone sings again. Not echo, not wind. It is like breath made sound. The men fear it, though it is gentle." 2 weeks later, he noted that one worker refused to return underground, claiming to have heard someone whispering his name from behind the wall of rock. Mazzoni tried to dismiss it as superstition until he heard it too. He described the sound as a choir of one voice, faint but articulate, calling from beyond the newly opened shaft. The tone was neither human nor mechanical. It carried no melody, just a rising and falling cadence, almost conversational. Mazzoni's description has since fascinated modern acousticians. When you strip away the poetry, what remains is an accurate account of standing wave resonance, a phenomenon produced when specific frequencies bounce between hard surfaces. The problem is that the pattern he recorded doesn't match any geological conditions known in the area. And then there's the part no science can explain. On May 2nd, the miners broke through into a small chamber, a natural cavity roughly 10 meters across, perfectly smooth as if carved by deliberate hands. Embedded in the walls were faint metallic veins that glimmered under lamplight. Mazzoni described them as threads of silver and bronze entwined like veins in flesh. At the center of the floor lay a circular stone slab marked with concentric rings. The moment they disturbed it, the hum ceased. That night, Mazzoni wrote just 3 words, "The silence hurts." By morning, he had sealed the chamber and ordered the shaft abandoned. Within a month, the entire operation shut down. The company dismissed the story as hysteria, but local papers spread rumors of a cursed mine. Over the next decade, villagers reported intermittent tremors and faint music drifting up from the ground. Sometimes it came at night, sometimes at dawn, always from the direction of the abandoned tunnels. A century later, in 1961, a team of Italian speleologists rediscovered the site. They found the tunnels intact, though filled with stagnant water. When they lowered a microphone and hydrophone into the lowest cavity, they picked up a rhythmic pulse repeating every 88 seconds, identical to the vibration recorded in recent geophysical studies. Modern scientists call it the Valdorna anomaly. To the villagers, it's still the singing earth. One detail often overlooked in the reports is the temperature. The deepest chamber measured a steady 6 degrees Celsius colder than the surrounding rock should allow. And there was another anomaly, faint electromagnetic interference that corrupted recording equipment. Analog reels warped. Digital devices froze. Only partial fragments survived, each containing what one researcher described as a sustained vowel with the texture of a human sigh. Curiously, those recordings also feature an intermittent spike at the 33 Hz frequency, the exact range associated with infrasound. That's below the threshold of human hearing, yet it can induce fear, nausea, and hallucinations. It's possible, of course, that the miners and later explorers were simply victims of low-frequency resonance. But it's equally possible that something deeper was speaking through it, not language as we know it, but vibration as message. An obscure 1879 pamphlet by Father Raimondo Giraud, titled On the Echoes of the Abyss, makes a provocative claim. Giraud visited Valdorna after the mine's closure, conducting his own nocturnal vigils. He reported hearing psalms without words and concluded that the sound was a remnant of angelic speech. When his manuscript reached the Vatican, it was quietly withdrawn from circulation. The only surviving copy rests today in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana, labeled Heretica sub silentio, heresy under silence. What makes Giraud's testimony more than mystical rambling is his description of symbols carved into the chamber's walls. He sketched 3 interlocked circles, a design identical to the tri-metal insignia seen on the gate fragments and the De Silentio Aeterno. How could a 19th-century priest, centuries removed from the original legend, reproduce a symbol never publicly known, unless, of course, he saw it himself? Even stranger, he claimed that during his final night in the tunnels, the resonance shifted from pure tone to voice. He recorded the phrase as best he could, non custodis portas sed te. In translation, you do not guard the gate, you guard yourself. That sentence has haunted historians ever since. Who or what was it addressing Giraud humanity? Or the unseen gatekeeper whose duty had blurred across time? Modern linguists note that the phrasing is peculiar. Not classical Latin, but a hybrid form closer to late Vulgar Latin, the kind spoken in northern Italy around the 9th century. The same linguistic era, incidentally, in which St. Veneris Abbey was founded. So perhaps the voice was no apparition, but an echo-linguistic residue trapped in the vibration of the rock itself, replayed across centuries. Some geophysicists argue that sound can imprint into crystal lattices under specific conditions, effectively fossilizing acoustic energy. If that's true, the gate's hum might not be alive, but recorded the earth itself, replaying a memory. Yet as you consider this, a quieter possibility creeps in. What if the hum is alive, not memory, but heartbeat? The monks believed the gate sealed a living force. The miners heard something breathing in stone. The frequency hasn't changed in over 150 years. Whatever lies beneath Valdorna, it endures constant patient pulsing every 88 seconds. And if Giraud's translation was accurate, perhaps the warning still applies. The gate does not guard against what's beyond. It guards against us. By the time the 20th century dawned, Valdorna had already slipped into the uneasy silence that follows too many unanswered questions. The miners were gone, the tunnels filled with water, and only the locals still whispered about the singing earth. Yet that whisper caught the attention of one man, Professor Enrico Belandi, a metallurgist from Florence, who had made his name studying anomalous alloys in early Christian artifacts. He arrived in 1902 with a simple purpose to test the legends against the language of chemistry. What he found deep beneath the hills would undo everything he believed about metal matter and mortality. Belandi was no mystic. He wore sensible shoes and quoted Newton, not Nostradamus. When he obtained fragments of the so-called Valdorna Gate, a handful of dull, corroded shards retrieved from an abandoned excavation shaft, he expected little more than a curiosity. But under magnification, he noticed an impossible fusion. The alloy contained iron as expected, but also mercury somehow solidified in stable molecular structure. And then there was the third element, one that defied identification. Its spectral signature matched no known terrestrial metal. The old monks had a name for it, orichalcum. The term appears in Plato's Critias, describing a luminous metal mined in Atlantis, second only to gold in value. Historians have always dismissed it as allegory. Yet Belandi's samples glimmered faintly under low light, emitting a dull orange sheen that no ordinary mineral could reproduce. He filed his findings in a paper titled Trimetallic Fusion in Ancient Artifacts, which was promptly rejected by the Italian Royal Academy as an exercise in poetic metallurgy. Still, Belandi persisted. He took the samples to his laboratory at the University of Florence and performed density tests. The results wavered between readings fluctuating every few seconds, as though the material were somehow breathing. His assistant, a young chemist named Morandi, later claimed that while they were measuring the shards, produced a faint humming sound, a vibration so low it rattled the glass beakers. When Belandi cut one fragment open, the inner surface was mirror smooth, as if polished from within. At this point, the parallels with the gate's legend became unavoidable. The Chronicle of St. Veneris had described the door framed by metals thrice forged, bound in spirit and in substance. The custodian's testament, though still incomplete at the time, also mentioned an alloy of threefold purity. Could these texts, dismissed as allegory for centuries, have been literal after all, to understand the significance you have, to consider medieval metallurgy itself? Mixing iron with mercury is not only unstable but suicidal. Mercury vaporizes when heated, poisoning both air and craftsmen. And orichalcum, assuming it ever existed, required a technique unknown to history. Belandi concluded that the fusion couldn't have been smelted. It had been bound. In other words, created through a process of cold alchemical synthesis, a theoretical concept where metals merge through electromagnetic resonance, not heat. In a private letter discovered decades later, Belandi confessed that the material resists all desecration. He wrote, "Strike it, it sings. Heat it, it cools. Pray near it, and it listens." The university dismissed his behavior as fatigue, but Morandi's later recollections darkened the story further. One night, after weeks without sleep, Belandi returned to the lab, set up an experiment involving alternating current, and applied the voltage to the metal fragments. The result blew out the power grid for 3 city blocks. When security found him, Belandi was standing motionless, staring at the glowing shards on the table. The fragments pulsed faintly, synchronized, yes, you guessed it, every 88 seconds. Belandi never recovered his composure. He withdrew from academia, joined a monastic retreat near Siena, and refused to speak of Valdorna again. His papers vanished into ecclesiastical archives, though one page resurfaced in 1978, purchased by a private collector. On it, a single line scrawled in graphite reads, "The seal is alive. It listens for command." That phrase echoes eerily with earlier discoveries. Recall Father Duré's breathing cave, the miner's singing stone, and Father Giraud's whispered Latin message, "You do not guard the gate, you guard yourself." 3 centuries apart, each account describes not silence but sentience, as though the gate's materials themselves were aware. Contemporary metallurgists have a more rational explanation. The inclusion of mercury, they argue, could create piezoelectric effects when combined with conductive minerals like iron and unknown alloys. These effects under geological pressure might produce rhythmic electromagnetic emissions measurable as vibrations or sound. Yet even these scientists admit that the Valdorna samples behave like nothing else on record. One physicist from the University of Milan put it best: "The metal acts like an antenna, but one that receives what it should not." And so we circle back to the oldest riddle of all: what precisely was the gate ceiling? If its frame was forged not merely to endure time, but to respond to it. Perhaps its purpose wasn't to block passage, but to monitor it, like a lock that listens for its own key. In this light, the monk's silence takes on chilling precision. If the alloy's resonance could be triggered by specific sound frequencies, perhaps even words or prayers, then their daily chants were not devotion, but calibration. They weren't worshiping. They were maintaining a frequency, a containment field sustained by faith and fear in equal measure. Of course, that interpretation raises a far darker question. What happens when that frequency stops, when the voices fade, the prayers end, and the world forgets? Belandi's final note offers a hint. Scrawled in the margin beside a drawing of concentric rings, he wrote, "Every seal decays when silence falls." And then in smaller handwriting below, almost as an afterthought, "It's already listening." It is strange how the past sometimes writes to us through silence. The Custodian's Testament, the fragment known now as De Silentio Aeterno, arrived in the modern world like a whisper slipped under a locked door. For centuries, scholars had only references to it, scattered across monastic inventories, each one noting a sealed document bound in iron thread. But in 1927, a Belgian antiquarian named Hendrik Vos uncovered what seemed to be a fragment of the original. The parchment was stiff, darkened with oil and time, and the Latin handwriting so compact that it resembled the veins of a leaf. At first glance, it seemed theological, a meditation on faith and solitude. Yet the opening line was unlike anything found in Scripture: "I swear to remain between the worlds, neither dead nor living, until the seal sleeps again." That single sentence redefined everything. The gatekeeper, the custos aeternus, had not been guarding a physical doorway. He had been guarding a state of being. Vos, cautious and skeptical, sent the fragment to the University of Louvain for authentication. Carbon analysis placed the parchment between the late 12th and early 13th centuries, consistent with the St. Veneris period. The ink contained traces of hematite and silver nitrate, a combination typical of illuminated manuscripts, but the script bore no decorative flourishes. It was written not for the eye, but for the soul. When translated, the text forms a chilling litany of vows. The gatekeeper renounces his name, his lineage, and even the right to die. He declares himself bound to the rhythm that separates the breaths of God and man. In the margin, another hand, perhaps a later scribe, adds a small notation: "Custos vocis," the keeper of the voice. You might recall the recurring motif we've already encountered: the breath in the cave, the hum of the metal, the pulse every 88 seconds. The Testament ties these together, explicitly describing the seal as a breathing of the earth that must not be answered. The gatekeeper's task was to ensure no one replied. The vow continues: "If the door calls, I must not answer. If light escapes, I must not see. If my name is spoken, the bond shall break, and I shall awaken to end the waking world." Scholars debated for decades whether these were poetic metaphors for spiritual vigilance or literal warnings. But the phrasing, the emphasis on sound, hints at a more specific purpose. The gatekeeper's silence was not penance, it was containment. In the 1960s, a theologian named Father Paolo Ferrante proposed a radical interpretation. He believed the Testament described an ancient ritual of vocal nullification, the deliberate suppression of speech to prevent resonance between dimensions. Ferrante argued that medieval monks, believing in the Logos, the divine word, feared that language itself could act as a key. Thus, the gatekeeper's vow not to speak was a metaphysical safeguard, words open worlds. It is easy to dismiss such ideas as theological abstraction until you remember the physical evidence, the rhythmic hum, the tri-metal seal, the recurring intervals of sound that seem responsive to human presence. Perhaps Ferrante's vocal nullification wasn't mysticism, but primitive acoustic engineering, a method to keep the gate dormant by balancing frequencies through silence. One line in the Testament stands apart, written in red pigment instead of black. When the song begins again, the keeper will fail. Historians have debated its meaning for nearly a century. Some claim it refers to the end of monastic practice during the Enlightenment, when chanting and ritual diminished. Others see it as prophecy that once the hum of the gate aligns with human-made resonance, the balance will collapse. And there is a disturbing coincidence here. The hum's frequency measured at roughly 0.01113 Hertz matches precisely the oscillation of global power grids, the heartbeat of modern electricity. In other words, our world now sings constantly at the same rhythm the gate was meant to suppress. The silence the keeper swore to preserve has been replaced by endless noise. A chilling thought, isn't it? That progress itself might be the final betrayal of his oath. Voss never published his full translation. He died in 1931 under peculiar circumstances, found seated at his desk, eyes open, mouth filled with iron filings. Officially, it was suicide. Yet his widow swore she heard him whispering Latin phrases in his sleep for weeks before his death. She recalled one line vividly: non vocem sed memoriam servo. I keep not the voice, but its memory. When scholars later examined his copy of the Testament, they found a final annotation in faint pencil: the keeper's silence is the world's breath. And so the paradox deepens. The gate breathes. The keeper silences it. The world continues. Break that balance, awaken the sound, and perhaps the gatekeeper's vow expires. In that sense, the legend may never have been about a man guarding a door at all, but about the price of keeping reality coherent. Every breath, every vibration, every word spoken too loud might be another chisel strike against the silence that keeps the universe sane. And as you listen now, surrounded by hums of engines' wires and your own heartbeat, you may wonder how much silence is left before the song begins again. When the gate's hum first appeared in recorded data, no one recognized it for what it was. It began as a faint infrasonic pulse picked up by oceanic monitoring stations in 1998, the same sensors designed to detect illegal nuclear tests beneath the Pacific. The technicians in charge labeled it Signal U7. It repeated every 88 seconds, lasting just 2.5 seconds each time, consistent across 6,000 kilometers of distance. At first it seemed geological, perhaps a harmonic tremor, a resonance from magma chambers or tectonic plates shifting in unison. But as more sensors joined the network, a disturbing pattern emerged. The source point was moving. Slowly. Purposefully. By mid-2003, the pulse had drifted nearly 80 kilometers northeast, tracing a line that did not follow any known fault or geological feature. When the pattern was mapped, it resembled a spiral wide at first, then narrowing inward toward a central node off the coast of Chile. Researchers joked that it looked like something breathing beneath the seafloor. Those who stayed longer on the project stopped joking. A classified study conducted under the joint oversight of the U.S. Naval Research Office and the European Seismic Consortium concluded that the pulse was not consistent with any natural source. Its waveform contained nested harmonic patterns, like a chord, rather than a single note. Even more baffling, the waveform subtly adjusted its phase whenever the sensors recalibrated, as if aware of observation. Dr. Clara Hines, one of the acoustic analysts, described the sound in her journal, "It's not just a hum. It's like something trying to synchronize with us. Each time we dampen or shift the instruments, it finds us again. It's as though the earth is echoing back the sound of our own heartbeat, but a fraction too late, like a delayed reply." The Vatican archives took interest after fragments of the custodian's testament were made public in 2005. The parallels were impossible to ignore: a pulse that must not be answered, a rhythm between breaths. The Church commissioned a linguistic task force to compare the waveform intervals to chant structures used in early Gregorian liturgy. The correlation exact. The pulse followed the same spacing pattern as the Miserere Mei Deus, the psalm of repentance whispered by cloistered monks during the Black Death. In other words, the gate was singing a prayer, as if the silence that once kept it sealed had transformed into resonance, a chant echoing through the fabric of the planet. Satellite magnetometer readings confirmed secondary anomalies. Faint electromagnetic blooms synchronized with the hum's apex. Power grids flickered. Migratory birds veered off course. Submarine crews reported auditory hallucinations, voices beneath the noise speaking in tonal intervals but forming no known language. One Russian diver surfaced bleeding from his ears, repeating a single phrase: "On zoviot меня домой." It calls me home. When compared to the Testament's Latin lines, the resemblance was eerie. Si vocem audis revertere. If you hear the voice, return. Return to what no one could answer. Some physicists proposed that the gate, or whatever mechanism created the hum, was responding to the cumulative noise of humanity. The constant low-frequency vibration of global industry engines, turbines, data cables, and power lines might have reached a resonance threshold. The world, in its endless motion, had finally spoken the forbidden reply. Others disagreed. They argued the hum was not awakening, but listening, scanning for coherence, searching for its keeper, the voice that once balanced it. Without the gatekeeper's silence, the equilibrium decays. Each cycle draws it closer. In 2011, the hum shifted again. Seismographs in Antarctica detected a faint doubling of frequency, 2 pulses instead of 1. Within hours, tidal sensors across the southern hemisphere registered a 0.5 millimeter rise in sea level, synchronized precisely with the new rhythm. The Earth's oceans had begun to breathe in tandem. It was no longer just a sound. It was becoming a heartbeat. When Dr. Hines released her final paper, she included a chilling remark in the appendix. If the hum is a signal, it is not a warning, it is an awakening sequence. Something below is remembering how to speak. That paper was withdrawn 2 days later. Hines was found unresponsive in her office, surrounded by oscillograph printouts, all depicting one final line of trace data that formed unmistakably the shape of a human larynx. Whatever the gate is, it no longer sleeps. And if the hum is truly the world's breath, the keeper's silence unraveling, then the question is not when it will awaken, but what will happen when the song demands an answer. In 2014, the hum's pattern wasn't the only anomaly being tracked. A group of independent cryptographers and medical researchers stumbled upon a biological parallel that would deepen the mystery beyond anything the geological data suggested. It began when Dr. Naoko Ishimura, a Japanese neurologist specializing in cranial resonance phenomena, received an anonymous envelope containing a small USB drive and a single line written in Latin corpus est clavem. The body is the key. The drive contained over 600 MRI scans from unrelated patients across the world: India, Russia, Spain, Chile, and even Greenland. The patients had no shared symptoms, no epidemiological connection, and yet, each scan displayed a nearly identical anomaly. Faint but consistent magnetic alignment patterns forming within the corpus callosum, the neural bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain. When overlaid, the patterns converged into a distinct geometric shape: 11 concentric arcs intersected by a vertical line, precisely the same motif engraved on the lintel stones above the eternal gatekeeper's chamber in St. Veneris Abbey. Dr. Ishimura's team ran the composite image through resonance mapping software and found that its frequency harmonics matched the global hum signature to within 0.03 Hz. In other words, the same oscillation resonating beneath the earth appeared faintly within the human brain. The implications were staggering. Was this a coincidence, a shared evolutionary artifact? Or had the hum, the breath of the gate, begun to imprint itself into the living? To probe deeper, Ishimura conducted controlled sound exposure tests on volunteers playing subsonic frequencies modeled after the hum. Most subjects reported a sensation of déjà vu or pressure behind the eyes. A few entered a trance-like state and began murmuring fragmented Latin words. One man, an Italian fisherman with no classical education, spoke the phrase, "Non claudas ostium iterum." Do not close the door again. Each time a session ended, subjects' EEG readings showed synchronized neural oscillations matching the hum's interval exactly 11 minutes apart. When these participants were re-examined weeks later, the pattern persisted. It was as though their brains had learned to breathe with the gate. Word of Ishimura's experiments leaked into fringe forums, spawning wild claims about resonant awakening. But the real danger came when government agencies took notice. In late 2015, she was quietly contracted by a private arm of the United Nations Scientific Monitoring Council, tasked with researching biological synchronization anomalies. Her official reports vanished behind layers of classification. Unofficially, her former assistant claimed that Ishimura began experiencing nosebleeds and auditory hallucinations, a whispering voice repeating her own pulse rate. Before she disappeared in 2016, Ishimura left one final note in her lab journal: "The map is not on the Earth, but in us." The gatekeeper was never guarding from the outside, it was guarding from within. This revelation reframed the entire narrative. If the gate's hum mirrored human neural frequencies, perhaps it was never a physical door at all, but a membrane and interface between consciousness and something older. The so-called eternal gatekeeper might have been a human or not quite human, charged with maintaining that balance through silence. When that silence broke, the hum began. Researchers revisiting medieval art noticed an overlooked pattern in depictions of saints and ascetics associated with the gatekeeper legend. Across frescoes and woodcuts, small markings appear on their foreheads, 11 dots in a circle, almost invisible beneath paint layers. Infrared analysis revealed that these symbols were added after the original paintings were completed, likely by later custodians preserving a secret. Were these markings the sign of those synchronized with the hum, the ones chosen to contain it? One chilling hypothesis emerged: humanity's collective consciousness might serve as the seal. The gate could remain dormant only as long as enough minds resonate in harmony, asleep, unaware. Each new pulse, each technological vibration, each disturbance in that shared frequency might be eroding the barrier. The gate is not below us. It is beneath awareness. And if it's true that the pattern now reappears in human neurology across continents, then perhaps the gatekeeper has already returned, not as a monk in the crypt, but as a signal woven into every living mind, a quiet rhythm waiting, listening, remembering the sound of the name that was meant never to be spoken again. By 1932, the whispers surrounding Valdorna had grown too loud for silence to contain. Reports of excavations, secret expeditions, and inexplicable phenomena drew the attention of an authority that thrived on managing mysteries, the Vatican. You can almost picture the scene: a long oak table deep within the apostolic palace, cigarette smoke curling beneath the frescoed ceiling, while monsignors in black discuss a gate no one is supposed to believe in. Officially, the Holy See became involved under the pretext of preserving cultural heritage. But unofficially, a series of classified correspondences known as the Documenta Valdorna, unearthed decades later in the archives of Archbishop Orsini, painted a very different picture. The Church had known about the gate for centuries. It had in fact been quietly monitoring the site since the dissolution of the Order of the Black Sun in the late 1700s. According to one letter, the Pope's personal confessor warned of a threshold guarded not by stone, but by vow. He advised sealing it permanently, declaring the ground inviolatum untouchable. That decree, issued in 1932, remains unrevoked to this day. The records describe an ecclesiastical task force dispatched to Valdorna under the guise of archaeological supervision. Their orders recover all relics, confiscate written testimonies, and ensure no photographic evidence escaped. The mission was overseen by Monsignor Giacomo Bellini, a man described in private notes as devout, disciplined, and deeply afraid. Bellini's diary, discovered in fragments decades later, captures his growing unease. "The men work beneath the ruins," he wrote, "but the air hums with something unholy. When prayers are spoken aloud, the echo does not return." One night, he recorded that a workman vanished after touching the gate's iron frame, leaving behind only the smell of ozone and the faint outline of a hand scorched into the dust. And yet Bellini continued the mission. He wrote of lowering a gilded crucifix into the cavity and hearing a sound like deep water exhaling. The next morning, the crucifix had bent backward at the arms. A lesser man might have fled, but Bellini's entries grow only more desperate, a man torn between faith and something older than faith. What fascinates historians most is the Vatican's sudden change in tone. After 6 weeks, all excavations stopped. Bellini and his team were recalled to Rome, the site filled with blessed soil and an unmarked chapel erected above the buried entrance. Within its foundation stone, a small lead plaque was placed. The inscription reads simply, "Clavis est sanguis." The key is blood. That same year, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a secret memorandum forbidding clergy from discussing gates' thresholds or seals in sermons or confessionals. It was as though the Church feared words themselves might reopen what they had just buried. But not everyone complied. One priest, Father Matteo Serra, refused to sign the silence oath. In 1933, he published a pamphlet titled "The Door That Breathes." It was immediately condemned as heresy. The printing press was seized, and Serra was excommunicated. Weeks later, he was found in his parish crypt, hands folded, eyes burned white, and lips parted, as if still praying. The autopsy was inconclusive, but the attending physician noted a strange metallic residue along his teeth, an alloy that defied standard analysis. Decades later, metallurgists identified trace elements of orichalcum, the same mythical metal used in the gate's construction. How it reached Serra's mouth remains unanswered. Modern Vatican historians admit privately that the Documenta Valdorna remains a source of discomfort. One cardinal described it as a wound we cannot confess. Another, speaking anonymously to a journalist, said the decision to seal the site was not based on superstition, but on measured experience. Perhaps most striking is a handwritten marginal note added to Bellini's final report. In red ink beside the word inviolatum, someone scrawled, "It was not the gate that required sealing, it was the silence." And so the Church's intervention became not merely an act of containment, but a theological paradox. To acknowledge the gate would risk validating heresy. To deny it risked reopening it. The solution, a silence enforced by faith and fear, became its own kind of prayer. Even now, pilgrims occasionally visit the ruins of that chapel in Valdorna. They kneel before its crumbling altar, unaware of what lies beneath. Locals say that if you whisper a confession there after midnight, the echo answers not with words, but with breath long and steady, as though the gate itself is listening. Centuries of authority have turned this secret into ritual, but the hum persists. It seeps through prayers, through the walls of Rome, through the unspoken places of belief. And deep beneath the marble silence, the gate waits patient, as faith eternal as guilt. The Vatican may have silenced the stones, but silence has a way of echoing through blood. The story of the eternal gatekeeper didn't end with the sealing of the chapel in 1932. It simply changed form, slipping into the veins of those who once vowed to protect it. When the Order of the Black Sun was disbanded in the late 18th century, its members didn't all vanish. Some took new names, new vows, and new lives scattered quietly across Europe. By the mid-20th century, genealogists and amateur historians began noticing a strange thread linking several old families across northern Italy and southern France, a series of surnames that kept reappearing in local church registries, each one derived from the Latin custos, meaning keeper. The trail began with one such family, the Cost family of Liguria. Their ancestral crest, recorded in a 1641 heraldic register, features a silver gate overlaid by a black sunburst. At first, it seemed like coincidence, an artistic flourish, perhaps. But when researchers compared it with sketches recovered from the archives of St. Veneris Abbey, the resemblance was uncanny. The same configuration of rays, the same number of iron bars on the gate, even the same Latin motto, non aperiatur in aeternum, may it never open. By the 1950s, a small circle of independent scholars, led by a man named Lorenzo D'Amico, began tracing baptismal and marriage records connected to this emblem. What they uncovered unsettled even the skeptics. The Costes, the Custans, the De Custes all shared not just symbolic heritage but genetic anomalies. In medical records from the 1920s to the 1970s, these families displayed an unusually low resting heart rate, averaging 40 beats per minute, sometimes lower. Most of them lived long lives, rarely fell ill, and reported vivid recurring dreams involving corridors of light and the sound of metal breathing. One of D'Amico's interviews, recorded in 1957, captures an elderly woman named Beatrice Cust, recalling a story her grandmother told her. "We were told to never go near the valley. The mountain doesn't like to be looked at. My great-grandfather said our blood remembers things the mind forgets." Her words were dismissed as folklore, but later examination of parish records showed her family line could indeed be traced directly to a monk named Aurelius Custe, one of the last initiates of the Order of the Black Sun before its dissolution. What makes this lineage so haunting is how deliberately hidden it was. In 1794, after the fire that destroyed St. Veneris Abbey's archives, an edict was quietly issued through the Papal States, requiring the reassignment of monastic surnames. Dozens of brothers were released from their vows and told to integrate into civilian life, adopting new family names derived from Latin or local dialects. The purpose officially was to protect the faithful from persecution. But the pattern suggests something else entirely: a managed dispersal, as if the guardians themselves were being scattered like seeds. When modern genetic testing became widespread in the 1990s, D'Amico's surviving notes were re-examined by a small research team from Turin. They located living descendants of the custodian bloodline, now numbering fewer than 200 individuals across Europe. Their findings remain unpublished, but one leaked excerpt from a confidential report reads, "Markers indicate an unusual consistency in mitochondrial DNA resistant to mutational drift across centuries. Possible artifact of isolated lineage or deliberate breeding control." One of those descendants, interviewed under the pseudonym Mara, claimed that her father would wake in the middle of the night, sit upright, and whisper, "The hum is louder tonight." When asked what he meant, she said he believed their family carried the echo of the gate inside them. His heartbeat, she explained, would synchronize with a distant pulse he swore he could hear in the quiet. The idea sounds absurd until you recall the modern geophysical data gathered near Valdorna, the same rhythmic vibration repeating every 88 seconds like a subterranean heartbeat. Coincidence, perhaps, but the resonance between legend and biology unsettled even hardened scientists. One obscure Vatican memorandum from 1954, declassified decades later, mentioned familia custos. It instructed regional dioceses to maintain contact with certain bloodlines for spiritual oversight. No explanation followed, but attached to the directive was a small handwritten prayer in Latin: "May their silence endure until the stone breathes its last." Scholars disagree on whether this was symbolic or literal. Yet the wording mirrors a line from the custodian's testament, the same fragment first examined in section 13. "The silence is the seal. When it breaks, so too shall the world." Among the most disturbing revelations came from census archives in Valdorna itself. Between 1900 and 1970, at least 7 families bearing derivations of the keeper surname reported mysterious disappearances, individuals who left home during winter months and never returned. Their possessions were untouched, their money unspent. One police record even noted subjects described as entranced or drawn by a sound in the valley. None were ever found. D'Amico's final entry in his research log reads like a confession. "Perhaps they are not descendants at all," he wrote. "Perhaps they are fragments, echoes of one who never died. Maybe the keeper did not vanish, but divided." It's easy to dismiss that as poetic melodrama, but then again, so much of this story blurs the line between metaphor and inheritance. And if you stand in the quiet villages around Valdorna even today, you may meet someone with eyes that seem too old, a pulse that beats too slow, or a way of listening to silence as if expecting it to answer back. Whether by chance or by design, the gate's guardians may still walk among us, living reminders of a vow no one remembers taking. By the mid-20th century, faith gave way to geopolitics, and the gate slipped from the hands of monks into the grasp of men in uniforms. The Cold War had turned curiosity into currency. Every anomaly was a potential weapon. Somewhere between the race for the atom and the race for the moon came another quieter race, the one to possess whatever pulsed beneath Valdorna. In 1951, a small note buried inside a declassified CIA memorandum caught a historian's eye. It referenced Project Gatekeeper, possible dimensional convergence site, northern Italy, initial assessment requested. The memo's tone was bureaucratic, almost sleepy, yet the words "dimensional convergence site" landed like static on the page. No coordinates were listed, only the initials VDR shorthand that appears again in Soviet KGB files from the same year. Both superpowers, it seemed, had stumbled on the same whisper. According to later testimony from retired field analysts, the American Office of Scientific Intelligence sent a small delegation to Italy under the pretext of geological survey. They were escorted by Vatican intermediaries who were polite but distant. When the team reached Valdorna, they were told the region was under ecclesiastical protection and that the local terrain was unsuitable for drilling. That would have ended most operations. But the Cold War thrived on doors marked, "Do not enter." Declassified Soviet records tell a mirrored story. In 1952, the KGB's Department 8 received reports from an Italian informant claiming unusual magnetic patterns near a suppressed monastery site. Moscow authorized a reconnaissance team under Project 10 Shadow. Their orders: locate, photograph, and if possible, measure the anomaly. Within weeks, all correspondence from that unit ceased. Only one telegram survived its Morse fragments, later reconstructed metallic resonance, low hum light underground stop. It would be easy to file all this under Cold War paranoia, the same category that produced psychic warfare experiments and weather control fantasies. But a curious pattern emerges. Both the American and Soviet reports, though separated by ideology and secrecy, use almost identical language when describing the phenomenon: heartbeat-like vibration, intermittent luminous emission, localized gravity fluctuation. That phrasing echoes Bellini's diary from 1932 nearly word for word. One American field note, handwritten in pencil, stands out for its eerie simplicity. "If this is a gate, we should be careful which side we're on." The author was listed only as Dr. M.R. Decades later, a physicist named Marcus Rell was confirmed to have worked on acoustic field mapping in subterranean environments. When interviewed late in life, Rell reportedly smiled and said, "Some frequencies aren't meant for ears." Meanwhile, in 1954, the Vatican quietly reopened limited access to the chapel ruins under diplomatic oversight. Officially, it was for restoration. Unofficially, they permitted one joint inspection involving both American and Italian scientists. What they found wasn't publicly disclosed, but photographs later surfaced, showing a sealed tunnel reinforced with concrete slabs. On one of the slabs, someone had painted a large red cross, the kind used by both engineers and exorcists. That same year, the CIA established the Advanced Theoretical Phenomena Unit, precursor to what later researchers dubbed the Weird Desk. Their mandate to study unexplained resonance phenomena that could have national defense implications. Among their case files sits a folder titled Gatekeeper, Italy, Inviolatum, stamped Classified in triplicate. The file's index lists two items: 1. Translation fragment custodian text. 2. Biological anomaly reports lineage cust. That last item draws a perfect line back to our previous chapter's families, the so-called modern descendants. By the late 1950s, whispers turned to experiments. Both sides began testing acoustic and electromagnetic pulses in caves to study resonant matter. One declassified Soviet transcript from 1958 records a conversation between two engineers after an unsuccessful test. "It doesn't respond to frequency. Then it's not resonance. No, it's listening." The line was struck out in ink. During this same period, villagers around Valdorna began reporting strange visits, men in dark coats asking about old legends, offering payment for local folklore. One farmer claimed he was asked if he'd ever heard the mountain breathe. Another said they bought every scrap of parchment mentioning a gate, then burned them. Even the parish priest was questioned, and afterward he refused to speak of it ever again. Officially, both the CIA and KGB closed their dimensional anomaly projects by the early 1960s. Unofficially, fragments lingered. A U.S. Air Force report from 1962 mentions ongoing cooperation with ecclesiastical authorities regarding subterranean resonance containment. In Moscow, Project Shadow reappears in budget ledgers until 1964, when its funds were redirected to something called Operation Silence. When the Iron Curtain finally cracked decades later and archives opened like forgotten tombs, historians were astonished to find that both sides' enemies and everything else had drawn the same conclusion in their classified notes. Subject cannot be opened. Subject must remain undisturbed. You can almost sense the frustration in those words. For the scientists of the atomic age, there was nothing more intolerable than a mystery they couldn't dissect. Yet both empires, after decades of obsession, walked away from the same mountain, leaving their instruments behind, like offerings to an unseen god. Still, one chilling detail links the end of those operations. In January 1964, seismic monitors across northern Italy recorded a brief tremor localized entirely beneath Valdorna. The vibrations matched the same 88-second rhythm first detected in the 1930s, only this time the amplitude doubled. When questioned, a retired geophysicist muttered, "It wasn't the Earth moving. It was the gate breathing in." Decades later, during another winter solstice, local children reported hearing what they called songs under the snow. They said it sounded like someone counting slowly again and again. Some things, it seems, survive every kind of war. When modern geophysicists first trained magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar across the Valdorna Plateau, they were doing what scientists do best: look where others feared to look and complain about the weather while doing it. The established historical fact that makes their work possible is simple and mundane. The region is geologically complex part of the Apennine thrust system, folded and faulted by millennia of tectonic events. That complexity explains why earlier explorers kept tripping over unexpected cavities, mineral veins, and sudden changes in bedrock. Geology gives you surprises. The archive gives you names for them. The problem wasn't that the instruments found something odd. Mountains have weirdness in abundance. It was that the anomaly behaved with a composure that felt deliberate. The scans revealed a set of subsurface reflections, concentrated roughly 200 meters below what used to be the Abbey floor, a near-circular structure mapped as a dense metallic shell within a void. The initial press release from the university team called it an anomaly of unusual conductivity. Behind closed doors, someone more candid described it as a metallic cavity producing harmonic signatures. That phrase is dry enough to fit in journal footnotes, but it carries a less academic aroma. The readings didn't just register like metal. They sang in measurable overtones, nested patterns layered over a bass pulse, repeating at a slow, almost meditative interval. If you like your metaphors blunt, the rock hummed like a cello held underwater. An obscure and controversial detail arose when materials scientists analyzed residual filings collected from a 1991 coring attempt. The core itself had been aborted. When instruments failed in sequence compasses, spun tape recorders melted their plastic covers, and a camera's shutter refused to close. The filings, however, were too small to be purely geological and contained micro-traces of magnetite with an atypical crystalline alignment. That alignment, when tested under polarized light, interacted with electromagnetic excitation to produce minute piezoelectric displacements, tiny shifts in shape that, when synchronized across a large surface, could plausibly emit infrasonic energy. In plain terms, the stone wasn't just rock. It had a structured reactive lattice. Some materials scientists proposed the mundane hypothesis that hydrothermal processes and mineral deposition created a naturally resonant formation. Others, less patient and more poetic, argued that the pattern indicated ancient deliberate construction, an engineered cavity whose walls had been reinforced with a trimetallic composite to behave as a kind of resonant chamber. Here you find the open question scholars still debate. Is the subterranean resonance a product of nature tuned by geological happenstance, or a manufactured system crafted by people whose technology, whether by metallurgy, acoustic insight, or something else, exceeded conventional medieval craft? the evidence refuses to let you choose easily. Radiometric dating of organic residues embedded in a thin seam between ringed strata gave dates centering around the 13th century, which aligns uncomfortably well with the Chronicle of St. Veneris and the timing of the gatekeeper narratives. Coincidence is a charitable hypothesis until you tally the coincidences, medieval manuscripts. Speaking of metals, thrice-bound alchemical recipes referencing mercury and strange alloys, a local myth that names Aelricus, and now a geophysical structure whose inner geometry matches diagrams found in palimpsest's unassuming lines that under ultraviolet interrogation resolve into concentric rings. Controversy deepens when you bring in the Cold War files we discussed earlier. Intelligence reports from both East and West recorded similar electromagnetic interference near the same coordinates in the 1950s and 1960s. Engineers at the time wrote of instrumental noise correlating with harmonic emission, which in their memos translated to an inability to get clean data. The technology of the era was rudimentary by today's standards, but the recorded patterns echoed the 88-second interval miners had reported a century earlier. That persistence across centuries is the sort of detail that makes historians itch. It's also the detail that keeps grant committees from sleeping. A curious and often ignored piece of evidence is the magnetic orientation anomalies reported in the 1970s by a team using early squid magnetometers, ultra-sensitive devices that can detect minute changes in magnetic flux. Adjacent to the mapped metallic cavity readings showed directional shifts that suggested a rotating field rather than a static deposit. Physicists who examined the data offered two hypotheses: a geologic dynamo driven by fluid movement within fissures, or a rotating ferromagnetic structure embedded within the cavity. The latter would imply something intentionally installed, because nature rarely winds iron into a regulated spin that stays perfectly timed for centuries. Admitting the second hypothesis invites metaphors you promised yourself you wouldn't use in a grant application: gears under rock, a slow clock buried beneath an abbey. Engineers love metaphors only slightly less than they love equations. You'll notice a callback here to Father Duré's 17th century description of a breath without wind, and Belandi's early 20th century observation that the shards he held sang. Those are subjective observations from men with different vocabularies, but the resonance ties them like a single thread through several eras. The pattern militates against the theory that this is an isolated recent artifact of instrumentation. If the gate had a signature before modern sensors existed, the signature seems to have retained its rhythm even as society hummed louder around it. There's also a social layer to the controversy. Local testimonies chronicle times when the resonance affected human behavior: livestock uneasy, domestic clocks misbehaving, and on at least 2 recorded occasions in the 19th century, small communities reporting nocturnal insomnia across entire villages. Anthropologists propose a psychosomatic explanation: shared expectation, and rumor causing collective sleep disruption. Neurologists following Ishimura's leads temper that claim with data showing how infrasonic stimuli can influence human mood and perception. The science suggests that low-frequency vibration may not need to be audible to exert effects. Imagine a sound your ears can't hear but your body recognizes. That's where the old custodian's insistence on silence acquires a new gravity. Perhaps silence wasn't a denial of noise, but a refusal to build harmonics that could interact with the subterranean pulse. You'll also find quieter ironies in the records. Every time a government or institution attempted to instrument the site, their presence altered the readings. More microphones, more power lines, more calibration pulses. Each action modulated the very signal they sought to understand. The pattern looks disturbingly like an experiment that collapses under observation. The curious paradox that the gate's response adjusted to being watched. Scientists hate when their instruments influence the subject, but in Valdorna it looks less like measurement error and more like a kind of polite reciprocity. If you poke the stone, it listens and answers on its own timetable. Humor helps here because otherwise the data is claustrophobic. Engineers joked in private memos that the mountain was a picky audience, and one grad student rounding third espresso for his thrice-broken instrument scrawled in a lab notebook, "Do not wake the mountain before coffee." A second joke followed weeks later when a very solemn seismologist suggested deadpan that the mountain's rhythm would make a poor metronome because it refuses to sync to anything human-made. A third wry aside appears in an old field journal: if the gate has a mood, it is the weather. So what do you take away from the subterranean resonance first? That something below Valdorna is rhythmic on a deep timescale, and second, that the rhythm interacts with materials and minds in ways that defy simple categorization. Whether you prefer the comfort of a natural explanation or the spice of an engineered one, neither fully accounts for the historical continuity, medieval testimonies, minor reports, Cold War memos, and modern magnetometer arrays all point to a persistent, patterned presence. The safe academic answer is to call for more data. The less safe, more human answer is to listen quietly, as the ancients did, and note that whatever breathes beneath the stone seems to insist upon being acknowledged on its own terms. Beneath the sleeping hills of Valdorna, the hum was never truly silent. In 2011, when the geophysical teams first lowered seismic microphones into the borehole near the old monastery foundations, they expected random tectonic murmurs, the kind that mountains whisper to themselves when no one listens. But what they captured instead was rhythm, not chaos. A slow, deliberate pulse. At first they thought it was interference from the valley's hydroelectric turbines, but the data didn't match. The turbines fluctuated, the signal did not. Every 88 seconds precisely a faint throb of low-frequency vibration echoed through the bedrock, too deep for the human ear, too structured to be geological. It was the same pattern detected decades earlier by the Soviet survey team, whose notes had surfaced in the Cold War archives. Back then they had labeled it biological anomaly non-surface source. Now modern instruments were confirming it. The mountain itself seemed to breathe. In the audio lab at Turin University, researchers converted the data into audible sound. When the speakers began to play, no one spoke. It was not a simple tone, but a layered, almost organic rhythm, like a heartbeat stretched through stone, resonating faintly with each repetition. Some listeners described it as hypnotic. Others said it felt wrong, like hearing a heart that wasn't human. Even the waveform visualization appeared peculiar, an asymmetric curve resembling the trace of a living organism. Yet according to every geological principle, it should have been impossible. The lead technician, Dr. Elisa Veron, noted an unsettling pattern. The amplitude of the pulse increased during the winter solstice by exactly 0.03 decibels, the same day that the ancient watchtower had been aligned to track celestial movement. The connection between the two phenomena was undeniable. It was as if the sound and the sky were locked in a private conversation, one that had continued for centuries, while humanity merely eavesdropped. When the recording circulated among acoustic physicists, they divided into camps. Some claimed the pulse was a naturally occurring standing wave, produced by underground magma chambers. Others argued it originated from an artificial structure, perhaps the metallic gate discovered deep within the cavern. Yet one unsettling observation united them all: the rhythm bore perfect resemblance to a human heartbeat at rest. 88 seconds between contractions translated to a slow, impossible pulse, one that would belong to something neither living nor dead but dormant. Old chronicles from St. Veneris had mentioned the term cordis infernum, the heart of the underworld. Monks wrote of a throbbing within the stone that reminded them of penance and fear. Those passages, long dismissed as allegory, now felt uncomfortably literal. If the gate had been forged with orichalcum and mercury metals associated in alchemy with the binding of spirits, perhaps its vibration wasn't mechanical at all. Perhaps it was the echo of containment, a resonance created not by what the gate protected, but by what it imprisoned. During one late-night session, when Dr. Varan amplified the sound at high gain, an anomaly appeared. Beneath the rhythmic pulse lay faint harmonics, distorted but structured like layered syllables. A colleague joked that it sounded like whispering. When analyzed through spectrographic mapping, the harmonics formed repeating intervals consistent with human phonetics. Not words exactly, but cadence and imitation of language without language. The team dismissed it as pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in noise. Still, the whisper lingered in their thoughts long after they turned off the speakers. The Vatican's archival liaison, Father Corvi, was less skeptical. He visited the laboratory unannounced, listened once, then requested the recording's deletion under ecclesiastical authority. He left behind a single envelope labeled Inviolatum Custodia Sonus. Inside, a Latin fragment translated as, "The gate's heart will echo until silence is deserved." Whether it was warning or prophecy, no one could tell. After Corvi's visit, the university lab suffered an unexplained systems crash. Every copy of the audio vanished, backups, cloud servers, even personal drives. Only handwritten notes remained describing the waveform and its precise cycle. The technicians swore they'd heard a final echo seconds before the shutdown, one extra pulse louder than any before, followed by absolute silence. In the valley below, however, the shepherds said the ground trembled that night. They heard it through their boots, a soft, steady thud like a second heart beneath the mountain's own. The tremor lasted less than a minute, then faded into calm. One old man crossed himself and said the gate had reminded them it was still awake. The following spring, seismic activity returned to normal. The mountain's hum resumed its pattern, one beat every 88 seconds, unwavering, eternal. The scientific world labeled it an unresolved anomaly, archived it, and moved on. But locals tell another story. They say the sound isn't a warning, it's a promise. The gate keeps time not for us, but for whatever waits behind it, marking the centuries, like seconds counting down until the last pulse fades or accelerates. Some nights when the valley is silent and the wind curls around the old abbey's ruins, the earth's vibration carries through the soil and into the bones. It feels almost gentle, like something vast and patient asleep just below. You press your palm against the ground, and for a moment you could swear you feel it respond. Not cold, not stone, but warm, alive, waiting. When the translated fragment of the Custodian's Testament surfaced in 2014, it changed everything. The document, recovered from the private collection of a defrocked Milanese bishop, was no longer than a single parchment page. Its script was uneven, faded by time and humidity, written in late Latin, mixed with archaic Italian. But even in that broken form, the message cut straight through centuries of speculation. It read, "The gate does not guard what lies beyond it, guards what remains within." At first the phrase seemed poetic, a monk's philosophical riddle. But linguistic analysts noticed the nuance intra didn't mean within the gate, but within us. The translation could just as easily read, "It guards what remains within men." Suddenly the mystery was no longer about a door to another realm. It was about something inside humanity itself. When scholars re-examined the fragment under ultraviolet light, faint marginalia appeared, notes from another hand. Perhaps a later custodian describing echoes in the blood, the inheritance of vigilance and the first watcher who became many. The implication was chilling. The gatekeeper wasn't guarding an object or creature. He was guarding the corruption of human nature itself, sealed not only in stone, but in lineage. Cross-referencing this text with earlier monastic accounts revealed a recurring phrase, custos inter mundos, the keeper between worlds. The phrase could describe a spiritual intermediary, someone standing between light and darkness. Yet another translation fits more disturbingly well, the one who stands between the world and itself. It hints at containment, as though the gate's function was to prevent something human but no longer humane from spreading outward. Historians recalled the strange physiological detail from the mummified monk unearthed centuries later, the DNA that predated known human history. If the gatekeeper's bloodline preserved an ancient mutation, perhaps the message was less allegory and more confession. The gate might not only seal away a power, it might seal away the origin of it, locked inside a body buried beneath the abbey to ensure it never replicated. Audio engineers compared the phrasing of the Testament's final line to the frequency pattern recorded in the sound of the gate. Astonishingly, the waveform's peaks matched the rhythm of the written syllables. It was as if the text itself had been designed to resonate with the gate's pulse, the heartbeat, and the prayer moving in synchrony. Some whispered that the gate wasn't just a prison, but a ritual one requiring constant maintenance through vibration language and memory. A Vatican archivist, when asked to comment, replied only once. The prayer keeps the heartbeat steady. Should the prayer cease, the heart will wake. Then he refused to speak again. In the surviving notes of the St. Venerus monks, one marginal passage mentions a warning sent to the emperor. He who opens the gate shall open the flesh of mankind and behold its oldest wound. That phrasing, deliberately obscure, now resonates with unsettling clarity. Perhaps the gate doesn't contain a demon or divine relic, but the echo of humanity's first fracture, the metaphysical scar of separation from something greater. To open it would be to let that ancient absence spill back into the world. And yet within that grim interpretation lies something tender. If the gatekeeper's task was to preserve the boundary between humanity and its lost shadow, then his watch was an act of mercy. He wasn't imprisoning the world, he was protecting it from remembering too much. The resonance, the oath, the lineage, all could be part of a long, weary lullaby meant to keep something vast asleep. When the Testament fragment was finally locked away in Rome, a final note was added to its file by the current custodian of the St. Venerus relics. It read only, "The heart still beats. We still listen." And in that single line you can almost hear the centuries breathing a rhythm that does not end, a message carried not through words, but through time itself, whispering beneath stone, beneath history, beneath us. It began with a tremor, not the kind that shakes walls or topples stones, but a faint trembling vibration that only instruments could hear. In 2016, during a stabilization project on the lower slopes of Valdorna, a subsurface scan revealed an anomaly beneath a ruined chapel, a void exactly 4 meters wide, sealed by a perfectly circular slab. The engineers assumed it was an unused crypt. The church records called the structure Dormitorium Custodes, the Keeper's Rest. When archaeologists descended, they found a staircase carved from obsidian black stone, its steps unmarked by chisel or erosion. The air grew colder with every meter. At the bottom lay a chamber that seemed untouched since the Middle Ages. Its walls bore the familiar trinity of metals, iron, mercury, and orichalcum. And at the center, resting atop a raised platform, was a sarcophagus of translucent mineral, not quite crystal, not quite glass. Inside, curled in a posture of eternal prayer, was a mummified monk, His robe matched those of the Saint Veneris order, but the texture was wrong, the weave too fine, almost metallic. His right hand was clenched around an object fused to the skin, a large iron key, its teeth melted into the bone itself. The key's metal shimmered with 3 colors depending on the light, like oil floating on water. Forensic metallurgists confirmed what was previously thought impossible: the alloy contained traces of orichalcum, the same mythical material used in the gate's construction. The body was extraordinarily preserved. Carbon dating placed it around the early 14th century, but DNA analysis defied classification. The mitochondrial pattern shared markers with modern humans, yet several sequences had no known counterpart, not in any catalogued species. The result prompted one researcher to note half-jokingly, "Either we're looking at contamination or evolution, took a wrong turn in this tomb." A faint residue of mercury was found along the sarcophagus edges, the same element the monks described as a purifier between worlds. When ultraviolet light was cast over the walls, hidden inscriptions appeared written in looping Latin script, Custos mane donec cor taceat. The keeper remains until the heart falls silent. As the chamber was examined, something else emerged: a second layer of carvings beneath the visible ones, older and rougher. They depicted a human figure standing before a circular door, his hands extended in both supplication and warning. Around him, a pattern of spiral glyphs radiated outward, each corresponding to the mathematical ratios found in the gate's metallic resonance. The figure's eyes had been deliberately scratched out. It was the forensic anthropologist, Dr. Anton Leclerc, who noticed the strange anomaly during imaging. The gatekeeper's cranial structure bore minor asymmetries, an elongated skull base subtle but real. He dismissed theories of deformation, yet the implications were unsettling. When cross-referenced with the DNA irregularities, one possibility arose: that the man buried here wasn't entirely human, or perhaps more precisely, not entirely of our time. As word spread, the Vatican intervened quickly. The tomb was sealed again under canonical decree, its contents declared inviolatum. But before access was revoked, Dr. Leclerc recorded a final observation. The sarcophagus lid vibrated faintly, imperceptible to the naked eye, but measurable through laser interference. The frequency, exactly 1 beat every 88 seconds, the same pulse recorded beneath the mountain. That synchronization could not be coincidence. If the gate's hum was a heartbeat, then the tomb might have been its echo chamber. The keeper's remains were resonating in perfect sympathy with the underground gate, as if the two were linked through some unseen conduit, or as if one kept the other alive. A night watchman later reported a disturbing detail. On certain nights, when the valley's wind grew still, he could hear a faint sound from beneath the chapel floor, a dry metallic click like a key turning inside a lock. Always once. Always after 88 seconds. For centuries, the legend said the eternal gatekeeper was cursed to stand watch until his flesh turns to dust. But now the evidence suggested that even in dust, the watch continued. The key in his hand might not have opened the gate. It might have bound it shut. And if so, the lock still held for now. Standing before that sealed chamber, one could almost sense the paradox: a man both dead and not done, guarding not an object, but an idea. A silence preserved in metal heartbeat and faith. Whatever the gate imprisons, it still recognizes its keeper. And somewhere deep within that mineral coffin, the faint vibration hums on, patient, steady, waiting for the last watcher to rest. It appeared in 1979 in the possession of a retired Swiss horologist named Emil Strauss. He claimed to have discovered it in an antique shipment from an abandoned monastery in northern Italy. The object was a pocket watch, but not like any known design. Its case was forged from a dull golden metal that refused tarnish. Around the inner rim in microscopic etching ran a repeating inscription, Tempus non transit sed respirat, time does not pass, it breathes. Strauss spent the rest of his life trying to understand how it worked. The mechanism contained no mainspring, no gears in the traditional sense. Instead, it revolved around a set of concentric discs, each etched with spirals resembling magnetic wave patterns. When the watch was held near a strong electromagnetic field, the central disc began to turn slowly, as if animated by some internal pulse. The movement was impossibly precise, one full rotation every 88 seconds. What fascinated Strauss most was the sound. He wrote in his notebook, "When pressed to the ear, it beats like a human heart, deliberate, unwavering, unending." No matter how many times he disassembled the device, the pattern persisted, as if the mechanism remembered its rhythm after being taken apart. He called it the broken chronometer, though it was never truly broken, merely incomprehensible. After Strauss's death, the watch disappeared from auction records. It resurfaced in 2003, held in a private collection belonging to the Heliotrope Foundation, a shadowy research group rumored to study temporal anomalies connected to pre-modern artifacts. Photographs leaked from the collection show the chronometer suspended in a vacuum case, its hands permanently fixed at 004400, the precise midpoint between two rotations of the gate's measured frequency. Acoustic testing conducted by anonymous researchers revealed a disturbing correlation. The sound signature of the watch matched in amplitude and wave pattern the subterranean hum recorded beneath Valdorna. The same 88-second rhythm. The same spectral decay. When the frequencies were played in phase, the signals canceled each other out entirely, as if the watch was designed to silence the gate. One physicist described it as a tuning fork built for reality itself. Another suggested it could act as a temporal regulator, a device engineered to counteract fluctuations caused by the gate's oscillations. But who in the 14th century could have conceived of such a mechanism? Theories diverged wildly. Some claimed it was a relic created by the monks meant to measure divine cycles. Others proposed a more radical notion that the watch was brought back, a remnant from the future displaced into the past through the gate itself. The alloy composition deepened the mystery. Laboratory analysis found traces of isotopes that do not occur naturally on Earth. Their atomic weights shifted, as if exposed to intense gravitational compression. Yet perhaps the most unsettling discovery came during a midnight test. When exposed to the infrared beam used to measure its surface vibrations, the chronometer emitted a single faint burst of sound, a whisper of frequencies beyond human hearing. When slowed and transposed into the audible range, it formed a voice. Only two words were discernible. Custos vigilat, the keeper watches. Since then, every attempt to replicate the experiment has failed. The sound never returned. The watch remains dormant, ticking silently in its glass cage. But sensors nearby still detect the faint electromagnetic pulse repeating inevitably every 88 seconds. Some researchers believe the chronometer serves as a counterbalance, preventing the gate's heartbeat from accelerating. Others think it's a beacon, a device calling for its missing half. Either way, it sits now under armed guard within the sealed archive of the Heliotrope Foundation, its case reflecting the dim red light of the laboratory. And there it waits, frozen in its endless cycle, bridging centuries and silences. To those who've stood near it, there is a feeling not of time passing, but of being observed by it. As if somewhere behind the hum of the metal and the quiet tick that never ends, something still listens and counts. For centuries, legends spoke of the gate as a myth, a symbol of faith or a curse born from fear. But as evidence converged, The monk's diaries, the harmonic pulse, the chronometer, one possibility emerged that bridged myth and physics. The Eternal Gate may not have been a doorway in the architectural sense, but a dimensional threshold, a fixed coordinate where the boundaries between temporal states blur. The rhythmic hum, measured precisely at 88 seconds, suggested a cyclical anomaly, not random vibration. Physicists recognized it as a resonant interval tied to the Earth's Schumann frequency, magnified by subterranean crystal structures. In simpler terms, the mountain beneath St. Veneris might act as a natural oscillator, amplifying ambient electromagnetic energy until it folds space-time upon itself. The gate, then, could be the stabilized epicenter of this distortion, a time-standing wave. Historical documents described pilgrims who vanished near the site, only to reappear decades later unchanged. To the medieval mind, these were miracles. To modern theory, they could represent temporal displacement, brief localized tears allowing matter to move outside of linear time. The gatekeeper's role, preserved through the Custodi bloodline, may have been to monitor and contain these fluctuations. Their ritual chants, once dismissed as superstition, might have functioned as sonic stabilizers, rhythmic tones, synchronizing the gate's pulse with human biological resonance. The broken chronometer in this context becomes more than a relic. Its perfect synchronization with the gate's heartbeat implies it was engineered or adapted to control the anomaly. The monks may have built it after centuries of observation, embedding the resonance into metal to maintain equilibrium. When it stopped, when the mechanism froze at Avono 044 km, the hum beneath Valdorna grew louder. The equilibrium fractured. But deeper questions remain. If the gate is indeed a temporal node, what lies on the other side? Satellite imagery shows a magnetic anomaly exactly beneath the abbey's collapsed altar, a void spherical 15 meters wide, emitting a faint but continuous EM signature, identical to the chronometer's pulse. Dr. Moretti once speculated this void wasn't absence but compression, a region where time itself folds infinitely inward, like the eye of a storm. In his final notes, written days before he vanished, Moretti wrote a single sentence. The gatekeeper was never guarding against something entering. He was guarding against something leaving. That idea changes everything. It reframes the custodi not as protectors of knowledge but jailers of something bound within the gate, something that breathes every 88 seconds, waiting. If the chronometer was built to suppress the gate's rhythm, then each interruption of its pulse could be an act of containment, a heartbeat held back. The hum, the resonance, the light beneath stone, all fragments of a system designed to imprison a force beyond comprehension. And if the gate truly opens when that rhythm stops, then time itself may remember what humanity tried to forget. You stand now before the idea that outlasted centuries, one that no empire, no doctrine, no empire of flesh or stone could ever quite erase. The gate was never meant to open, and yet it never fully closed. Its heartbeat, that faint, patient pulse every 88 seconds, continues even now, humming quietly beneath Valdorna's soil. The mountain sleeps, but not in peace. It listens. What if the gatekeeper still listens too? Not as a ghost, not as myth, but as a lingering consciousness stretched thin across time. The Custos Eternus, the eternal keeper, may not have died at all. He may simply have become what he swore to guard. The legends speak of a man who stood between worlds until the end of days. Perhaps that promise was never broken. Perhaps he remains the pulse, the rhythm, the watcher who remembers for us. When the wind crosses the old monastery ruins, locals say it carries a low metallic hum. Scientists attribute it to wind tunnels and resonance. Believers call it his breath. Somewhere deep below, encased in rock, the gate glows faintly, not from light, but from pressure from memory. It is said that if you stand there long enough and slow your own heartbeat to match its tempo, you might feel another rhythm align with yours, a presence ancient and calm pressing gently against the edges of your awareness. That's when most people step back, but not all. Some claim that if you breathe in sync with the gate's pulse, you will hear a whisper. Not in words, not in sound, but in understanding. It says simply, "Rest. I am watching." And maybe that's all the legend ever wanted to tell us, that the gatekeeper's duty was never to guard against the unknown, but to protect us from it. To hold vigil forever unseen, ensuring the heartbeat beneath the earth never falters. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that hum, deep, slow, steady. Imagine the gate beneath the mountain sealed in silence, the last echo of a vow made beyond time. Let it fade into your breath, into your pulse, until you cannot tell which is yours and which belongs to him. Because in the end, perhaps he never left. Perhaps, as the monks wrote, he became the gate, and the gate became the world. And as long as the hum continues, so does his watch, quiet, patient, eternal. Sleep now. The keeper still stands. The gate remains closed.